start by just asking the members of the panel to very quickly introduce themselves to you and, more importantly, to tell you what their companies do so you can understand where they're coming from. So we'll start down this end, please.
Thanks, Dave. Rob Leslie is my name. I'm the founder of a company from Ireland called Sedicii. And we're developing some cool cryptography to allow organizations match and compare information without sharing the information. So there's a very strong privacy component to what we do, where a bank might want to verify a passport with a government, for example. It can do that without disclosing the actual raw information in the document, or a utility bill with a utility provider, or a telco with a utility provider. It's an anybody-to-anybody scenario as long as you've got a common set of attributes that you mutually agree need to be tested and verified. But nobody shares anything except the result.
Perfect. Robert.
Hi, Robert Prigge, CEO of Jumio. Jumio is the world's largest AI-powered identity verification provider. We do everything from ID, identity, document verification, and even biometric authentication.
Carey, Kolaja.
Carey, please.
I'm the COO of Authentics. Authentics uses cutting-edge technology to automate the association between physical and digital identities and verifying them in seconds and not minutes. One thing about Authentics I'll just say that most people don't know is that we started over 20 years ago in securing borders as well as airports. And so our technology and our library of algorithms that we have is built off of the systems and the hardware and software that keep us all safe.
Thank you. Krik.
My name is Krik. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Fourthline, a regulated financial institution based in Amsterdam, subject to the supervision of the Dutch Central Bank. We offer KYC solutions specifically tailored to banks and fintechs, ranging from IDMV but also to fully outsourced solutions where we offer everything that is needed for a bank to onboard a customer, both from a compliance perspective but also from a risk and fraud perspective.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, guys. Right, let's get the conversation going by opening up to people. And by the way, if you want to ask a question, all you do is go to the app, go to the menu that says track, whatever. Choose the track that says digital identity. Within the digital identity track, you'll see a button that, I'm joking. If you want to ask a question, just put your hand up. We named our app. If you want, these people are smart people. They don't know what you're going to ask them. Don't pass up the opportunity to ask them questions. If you want to ask them a question, just put your hand up and ask the question. I can see most of you from up here, so this will work okay. So let's start the conversation by showing people a little bit about the big picture. Rob, you kind of alluded to the fact that actually, I think for a lot of us in the room, the technology has already got to the point where it can solve most of the problems. And in fact, the technology can solve problems in ways that a lot of people don't realize it can solve them. So what are the actual challenges in the space at the moment? Like for you guys out there on the front line, technology doesn't seem to be it all works well enough. What are the actual challenges out there?
It's a really good question because we struggle with this on a daily basis. The tech that we've developed, things called zero-knowledge proofs, multi-party computations, they've existed for a long time. And you can do what you need to do with the technology. The problem is the mindset within organizations to allow the organization to do what needs to happen. We've seen, the discussion today and yesterday in various different panels talk about collaboration. And banks are not good at collaboration. They've been sort of educated their whole lives to think in terms of operating in a silo. We need to keep our data safe within our four walls. We're not going to share it with anybody. And when you say to them now, well, you don't have to share anything with anybody, but you got to collaborate and allow computation to happen on your data and on somebody else's data, they just react as if you've poured hot water on them. It is a hard sell at the start. And I liken this to what I call the empty swimming pool. That if you can get, when people come along and they see an empty swimming pool, their first reaction is sort of one of fear. There must be something wrong. I'm not going to be the first in the pool. But as soon as there's a few people in the pool, suddenly it's okay. And everybody will then want to participate because they feel they're missing out on something. So I think we're right at that flipping point now, that turning point where organizations are realizing we've done everything we possibly can within our own four walls. We now have to go outside our four walls. We're still going to keep our data private, but we're actually going to be able to compute other stuff on other people's data in a confidential way. That actually might contribute to solving some of our problems.
That sounds like we're at kind of a cusp with the technology, is that?
Yeah. Oh, you want to go ahead?
Go, Billy.
I was just going to add, so prior to Authentics, I was at Citibank for 4 years. And you want to talk about trying to move a Titanic and to get them to think differently about consumer experience. It was quite an upwards battle. And I would absolutely say it's about process, but it's also about value prop. And I think that's something we really changed at the bank, and we saw breakthrough behaviors and breakthrough changes. So on the process side, you're right. Like, you have to not make it personal. And there's a framework we introduced that is kind of funny when you look back on it, but we would ask everybody, is your opinion of us trying to improve our KYC, AML, digital verification process, is it your opinion, is it policy, or is it law? Because if it's your opinion, and you've been at the company for 30 years, the world's changed 30 times over. And so we have to change that opinion. If it's policy, then it was a very different conversation to have internally versus it being law. And that helped, I think, to remove the emotion of people not wanting to jump in the pool. But I'll also just add that I do think it's a value prop. So when we first were digitizing the onboarding experience for Citibank, what we wanted to do, or what someone asked to do in the compliance area, was to say, you need to KYC your customers. So the language that literally came forward was, we have to KYC you. The consumer knows nothing about that. And if you shift the value prop to, we want to verify who you are so that we don't disrupt your service with us and we can keep you and your information safe, it was a game changer because you drove engagement that way.
But just to push you guys a bit harder, but I know what you're saying about process, but what's changing in those processes? I mean, what is it that you guys are doing to make the whole process more smoother, more efficient? It mustn't disrupt the journeys, but I think the process itself seems to have.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, we're all you said that technology is already there, able to solve a lot of the issues, and I think that's true. We are in a little bit of an arms race, between the fraudsters and ourselves. Unfortunately, the collateral, damage there is the consumers. That as there's, vendors and fraudsters making increasingly, intricate ways to get around each other, you still have 99 point whatever percent of your good customers that you want to convert those strangers into customers, and that really revolves around having a very smooth customer experience. In our case, getting answers back in real time, having liveness detection, making sure that it's a live human being, and just keeping it as simple as possible. So we'll look at the space, and we'll have people in the verification industry that'll take 12 screens in order to go through a verification process. That's insane. And so now companies used to be competing on their brand that they built through their branch where they have people go in. Now it's through the experience that you create, through your app and other mechanisms. And it can't be about catching the 1% of the fraudsters. It has to be about converting the 99% of the good guys and turning them into customers. If they're showing up and trying to turn into a customer, you should be able to do that in one try.
Okay, so you guys have processes, not just the technology that can do this stuff. But because I was this morning, Google, I thought I'd find a couple of topical news stories so I appear up to speed on this stuff and whatever. And so the first thing I find is that identity fraud is absolutely out of control, and the biggest growth is in synthetic identity fraud in the US. And I learned a new word which I just want to share because I love it so much, which is that the fraudsters are creating shelf babies. You love that word? They're making shelf babies, which are these synthetic identities which they stack up until they want to use them. So if your kind of stuff is all that, how come this synthetic ID fraud is out of control, according to Google?
They didn't use the technology that's there. So the article in the Wall Street Journal you're referring to, you could use nothing but an SSN trace, which is standard in the US market, which is ridiculous because it all was traceable to one single address in a strip mall in the middle of nowhere. So one of the things you can do with technology is just leverage the whereabouts of a client. And I can honestly say, at least for our technology, we would have picked the second synthetic ID fraud out of it because it didn't make sense at all at that point in time.
For me, Dave, it's
You believe him?
partly I do, yeah.
But like, how is it so out of control if it's so easy to spot?
It's because people don't utilize the tools at their disposal. I'm totally agree with Krik that my wife had her identity stolen, and it's because the barrier to entry was they were asking for a social security number and a name, and thanks to the countless breaches that exist, you can almost Google that stuff and find it out. And so if instead you're doing, looking at identity documents, getting biometrics, getting the other mechanisms that all the different vendors at this table provide, you fix that problem. But instead, people try to create, instead of a wall that you have to go over, they try to create a curb. And they put such a low barrier on it and don't really use the technology at their disposal. And they've just set the bar way too low.
Hey, David, can I offer something too? Because I want to touch on what Kurt said, because I think it's really important that we all know the fraudsters are getting more intelligent. We have to keep up. We know synthetic, ID growth is going to upwards of $1 billion in losses. The reality is that we have to come together to fight fraud. So when you look at synthetic fraud and you say, have I seen this person before? Have I seen this address before? Have I seen this location before? It becomes about patterns and repetitions and identifying conflicts. And so Kurt said, his technology will pick it up the second time or the third time. Well, what in the event if we were looking at the data together and that what happened on one customer, when you pick up that synthetic piece of fraud or ID, you can see it on another customer, and so it absolutely is.
I think it's a brilliant idea. It's exactly what we're doing already. So we're already doing it on a cross-partner and a cross-border basis in Europe without breaching GDPR. And this is what a lot of banks are asking for. And then again, it comes to the point, the technology is there. I mean, the Dutch banks literally send a letter to the Ministry of Finance asking for this, whereas they're just not aware that it's already there, and it's exactly doing what Carey is saying. We can catch them on a cross-partner level.
So on the process and technology stuff, you guys are actually pretty optimistic about this sort of stuff then, right? So if people just deploy, I mean, I'm not just saying your products, but if people deployed the stuff that's already there properly, then actually, we'd be making a significant dent in that fraud. We don't need something new to be invented.
Well, you need the technology on a large scale to share, and I would be, as Carey said, a big fan of that. I think if you look at it objectively, one, I think the UX of walking into a bank branch is way worse than anything that is offered today. So I think the customer is already a big winner. And the second thing is, if you look at the old technology, so just a simple example, humans are really bad at facial recognition, and even worse, you cannot train them at it. All of the vendors at this table have facial recognition software that will beat a human any day of the week. So I'm actually super optimistic about it.
Is that true? You'll have software that's better than people already?
Absolutely.
Comparison.
No, I'm very bad at face recognition, so I could use that software. I don't recognize anybody walking around.
I mean,
Create a special app for you, David, okay?
But here's a slight issue with that. So in the UK police are about to deploy face recognition in London, spotting criminals in London. And a very good friend of mine, Jamie Bartlett, said, if that technology doesn't work, can you imagine the chaos that it's going to cause? But if the technology does work, it's going to be even worse.
Right, but
so having AI face recognition that's better with people than better.
Yeah,
I don't like the sound of that.
Yeah, so I'm sorry. I'm from San Francisco, where we've banned facial recognition in public buildings and so forth. We really have to make a distinguishment between facial recognition and using biometrics for verification, right? A one-to-one of comparing a face to an ID is totally different than me taking a picture of everyone in this room and trying to figure out who's a criminal. One is Big Brother, the other is really just proving you are who you say you are. And so I think even in the public, it's on all of us to distribute that a little bit better. I think people get very confused about what that means, and I'm sorry, I think there's a massive difference between a camera at every corner in London and actually comparing the biometrics to prove that you are who you're asserting that you are.
It's your typical customers are by and large financial institutions, right? I mean, no?
About a third are FSI and about 2/3 are non-FSI, sure.
Can you give me some examples of non-financial institution?
Sure. So the world's largest.
You said airports and stuff, right? Travel.
Well, that's our family brand,
Yeah,
you know, where it
Robert
is. But no, I think, you know, a lot of us service the same customers, and particularly Robert and I, because a lot of the big customers do a waterfall, which is trying to catch all the fraud. So you've got certain players that are great in EMEA, other players that are great in Asia, and other players that are great in North America, some that are automated and some that aren't. But you know, a lot of the customers, I think, are, you know, the Airbnb, the Ubers, the Grabs, others that are in the sharing economy, where we talk a lot about financial fraud, but the reality is there's other types of fraud and distortion fraud that's happening as you're starting to verify two people at the end of a transaction that may or may not have monetary exchange. And so that's becoming an increasingly need for us to look at fraud differently.
What I was going to fish for with that question was, you know, for people here in the fintech space, is there anything you can point to in other areas where maybe we could learn a thing or two from what's going on there?
Just in relation to facial recognition, I am not a proponent of facial recognition. I think from a technology perspective, it absolutely solves a problem. But from a societal perspective, if it goes wrong, the potential for catastrophic damage to wide numbers of people is there. And I don't think we've put enough thought into how do we mitigate the downside before we deploy this on a wide scale, whether it's in airports or in the street in a very tightly confined use case.
But you guys do facial authentication, right? Not identification. You're matching the face against the ID document. You're not, are you? You're not searching Facebook and...
There are instances where organizations are searching against billions of facial templates on the internet today.
Who? You mean like Tinder or something? Or?
There's a company in the US, I can't remember the name of it offhand.
It's called Clearview. There was an article in the New York Times, but they've been scraping images from Facebook. So there's not even a discussion as to whether that's legal,
Right.
let alone whether it's ethical.
But
So
the point I'm making here is that if that happens and there is no control or regulation around it, and that leaks to another bunch of companies who are in Nigeria and China and wherever, it's now out of control. And we have a scenario on our hands that is essentially unstoppable. So we have got to be really careful with this stuff. What I'm espousing here is that for biometric-based checking, we absolutely need to be testing against absolutely rock-solid authoritative sources. Now, in many cases, some people will say, I don't trust governments with this stuff, but I actually do trust governments with this stuff. Because they're the ones that give you your primary ID today. They give you your name and they attest that you are who you say you are. And if we can't trust our government to do what we need to do when it comes to the most basis of tests in relation to our identity, we've got a real problem on our hands.
Right, now let's talk about something a bit more optimistic. So I think we've... No, because I don't want people to think that you're doing biometric identification and building these databases. That's not what you guys are doing. You're I hope you're using biometrics in a kind of responsible way, which actually we want, because what we don't want is people's faces being scanned all over the place. What we want is people being onboarded correctly once using your stuff, and then once they have their digital ID, like the guy from Jamalta was saying this morning about La Poste, you should be online using your digital ID, not your actual ID, right? That's how we should be making
David, I
more
feel like
contribution.
it's a responsibility to myself, and I think for all of us also say whether companies choose to use biometric data, one-to-one verification, which I think we would all more espouse, versus more generally like you see in the public arena, it's really about how it's stored, it's about how it's encrypted, it's about access, it's about, because we have effectively been linking a payment instrument to a biometric identifier since Apple came out with Apple Pay 6 years ago. So I think for us to think that it's not happening and we're using it for multiple reasons would be a little bit remiss. And what I care more about is, I care about that, but how do we store it? How do we protect the information that is already being captured?
But you guys, you look after, you put it on Dropbox or something, do you? Or I'm joking, I know you look after it. Okay, so the problem is horrible and it's getting worse. You guys have stuff that can fix it, but not enough people are using it or using it properly. I hope the audience is taking some optimism from that. But I want to delve down into the technology a little bit more, because I want to open up that point that Rob touched on at the beginning, which is quite dear to my heart, which is the state of the technology, particularly cryptographic technology, is such that it seems to me that technology can deliver some quite counterintuitive solutions into the marketplace, which if the policymakers and regulators kind of understood more, they would actually. So this idea that you can identify people and learn things without giving away personal data all the time. If you live in a world where you think of a person as an index card in a file, it's quite hard to imagine how that stuff would work. But I sort of feel there's actual real optimism in that space. So can you guys explain a little bit more about these new technologies and how exactly they work?
I don't think it's just the technologies, to be honest. It's also the legislation. So if you look at it from a European perspective, so getting back to what we said, so banks should use the technology that's available. They should also use the legislation that's available. And when it comes to data protection, GDPR in Europe here is extremely strict, so we're very fortunate to have that in place. But I think the same thing applies to how can you, once a client has been properly verified, how can you leverage that identity? And again, Europe is well advanced with that, with the EIDAS legislation, which can exactly do what you just described. I think, Rob, you already explained what the tech aspects of that is. But again, make use of the technology that's there. It even states that financial institutions can share identities between themselves. So it's there, if the banks only dare to do it.
But the sharing of data is the sort of scary part, which I think Rob was edging towards. So if we can find ways to exchange the proofs about the data rather than the data to greatly simplify what's going on, so that people's personal data stays under lock and key, but because of your technology associated with their real identities now, then actually we can do something a bit more transformation in this space, can't we? It isn't just about speeding up the onboarding process and so on. It's about making a much more fundamental change about how people represent themselves online and the security models that go with it.
So there's a couple of things that we've been working on for quite a while. One is a thing called zero-knowledge proof. And zero-knowledge proof has been around for 30 years, but it's been sort of hidden in a box. And what it does essentially is it allows you to prove that you know something without having to disclose what you know. So imagine a world where you could prove that you knew what your password was without ever having to disclose what the password was. And the fact that you were able to prove that was good enough for the service provider, because they don't need to know it then. Now, we've applied this in a bunch of different contexts where we're proving addresses with banks and utilities. We're proving someone is over a certain age in order to allow them access to a service. But none of the other sort of core identity attributes linking to that person are ever disclosed in the course of proving the result. So all of that the vendor really wants to know is, are you over 18 so that I can deliver this service or product to you? And as long as it's coming from a reliable, trusted source to say, yes, it is, or yes, this person is, then that's all I need to know. I don't need to know any more about that. But today, for example, if I was to go into a bar and they'd ask me, are you over 18 or over 25? Well, they know with me, but and you, Dave. But
I still get asked.
But you bring out that 1965 ID card, yeah? That's what you do. You bring out your ID card and have to flash all the other pieces of information about you. Zero-knowledge proofs allow these kind of things to happen without you having to do this stuff. So we're envisaging a world where you could verify a whole bunch of stuff with different authorities for these pieces of information and essentially establish, yep, he does live at that address, he does have this mobile phone number, he does have an account at this service provider, and build up a very dynamic, rich picture of who a person is without actually sharing anything, which is really a dynamic view of you, which is how you would like to be best presented, I think, rather than a static view of you, which was captured 5 or 10 years ago when you were embedded into a passport, and you looked completely different to what you look like today.
These actually, when we were talking about this, these more dynamic approaches for things, that seemed to be quite core to your sort of next generation of products. Is that a fair way of summarizing it?
Yeah, so for us, obviously the market started with things like ID and identity, which is like selfies. More and more, you're getting into biometrics, authentication, liveness detection, proving that you're a live human being and that it's not a deep fake or something like that. So for me, I think there's 2 points I wanted to make. Number one, I think increasingly it's more about things like certified liveness detection to make sure that it's a live human being you're dealing with. Things like authentication, re-verifying that it's the same person. And yet, in some ways, forgive me for being the rain cloud on the panel here, we spent a lot of the beginning of our discussion talking about our frustration that so many people just ask for a name and social security number, and yet we keep talking about even more and more advanced technologies, which is great because we're all in that business. But for me, it's just a bit of a disconnect in the industry that we need to close the gap on. That I would probably argue, so zero-based or zero-knowledge proof, it's from MIT in the 80s. Even though it's old technology, it's still in its infancy in a lot of ways of how it can be applied. And yet, there's just such simple things that we can do to make the efficacy of security that much better. Like right now.
Also, I think a lot of people might not realize how far the technology has come on. So there's people in the audience. This is not their specialist field. There's people in the audience that are thinking of creating new businesses, new.
Of course.
And they don't realize they can just call up you guys and fire up an API and get going. I mean, I think people don't understand where the technology has moved on to. I honestly think that.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So just continuing the optimism route for a moment, what do you think is, if we're just looking at the next sort of 2 to 3 years, what do you think is the next development in this space that's going to help people in the room? Without giving away any trade secrets thing, talking generally, where do you think the business is going right now that's going to help these guys?
I think it's going to move towards your next KYC process is going to be your last one. And then we're going to do some of the technology that we
That's
just...
kind of bad news for your businesses, isn't it?
No, it's not. Because it doesn't mean that then the work stops. We already have technology in place that continuously monitors clients if our partners want to, which means that you can, with very small data points, I can see whether it's still consistent, and I can also flag something if it's no longer consistent. And getting back to what Rob mentioned, if you take a snapshot of someone at the time of sign up, nothing may be off, but if over time data points that you collected at the sign up become suspicious, you want to be able to flag that to banks. And it's sometimes very strange. I can pinpoint a specific address in the Netherlands where we know money mules are active. So that's something that you can actually not pick out with technology because it's a real person with a view ID document. But if you look at other data points, you can start seeing over time, even though this is a real person with an authentic ID document, I'd still be extremely careful if I was a bank. So it's about those things where again, the technology is there and you can make it super simple for both the banks and their end clients.
Carey, where do you see things going next?
I would agree with Kurt. We're moving to a world where verification of somebody is a one-time event to where it's a continuous event. And I do believe that where it's a very active task or active action that your customers need to perform, I take a picture of something or I link an account or I share some information, I do think Kurt's right. I think it's going to move to very passive. And as part of that, I think it's going to be our collective responsibility, not just ours, our collective responsibility to give the customer the controls to configure when and where they want to be prompted, to be notified if there may be some risk on their account. And so KYC as a term, know your customer, is not you know who I am when I opened up my PayPal account in 2003. I'm a very different person, suitability of the financial products, what my life looks like. Have I done bad behavior or good behavior? But yet using that one-time event isn't fully representing of who I am. And so I think Kurt's absolutely right. And I do hope that as an industry, we come together to fight the fraud as it becomes more sophisticated, because I think that's what everybody needs.
The classic example, everyone used to say it's things you know, things you have, things you are. I think in a lot of ways, I was trying to say this before, that the zero knowledge proofs and things like that are, in my mind, almost anti KY or KYA. I'm sorry, I'm blanking here. Things that you know are, thanks to the countless breaches, increasingly irrelevant. Things that you have, SMS can be spoofed and intercepted. It happens all the time. I think increasingly it has to migrate towards things like biometrics and advanced technologies. I totally agree with Krik that there'll be onboarding, and then there's going to be re-verification. That can be security challenges. It can just be monitoring them, passively for behavioral changes over time. And I think that's where it needs to migrate to. But I think also it needs to migrate away from things like KYA, or where you're basically tying it to database searches and pinging data that's now public data, thanks to all of the breaches. I just don't think you can rely on that anymore.
Robert, if we do make this shift from static to dynamic verification, which I think I've picked up from the panel is the next step, with the kind of technologies you're talking about for privacy and so on, are we finally going to see, I mean, I'm not asking you to make a prediction, but I'm just hoping, are we finally going to see some actual significant impact on the problem of identity fraud?
Absolutely, without a doubt. And what I think will happen is that we will stop looking at the person as an entity and start looking at the person plus their transaction history. So we will expand the horizon from a static view of an individual, which is your static attributes, to those attributes that surround you that are dynamic, that I can monitor in almost real time. And you, as the person who initiate most of those, are the person who can authenticate whether they're real or not for me. So I'm getting real-time information that will allow me to put a record of you, which is, I know who you are, I know where you live, I know how to contact you, and tie that to transaction activity. And if I need to identify a money mule, I will know straight away that if the money came from somebody in New York and I live in Ireland, there's a problem straight away, because I've been able to tie that transaction to me.
We'll be sending it via Bitcoin, Rob, so don't worry about it.
I'll nail it.
Listen, look, everybody, they didn't know what questions I was going to ask them. You got honest opinions from people who are at the absolute forefront of this industry. I hope you appreciated listening to their opinions as much as I did. Please join me in thanking them.